They say the dark is quiet, but I don't think it is. Sometimes it listens back. Where are you right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Just try to stay still. Sometimes the quiet moves. The dream had not been remembered clearly at first. Like most fragments of sleep, it had slipped away upon waking, washed in morning light and static. But as the day had passed, small moments had returned, not fully, not with detail, but in sensations, in pieces. It had started with a road, not a highway, not a street, just a road, winding, nondescript, caught between trees that had not moved. Two figures had been noticed there. Girls, perhaps, or the silhouettes of girls. Both had worn clothes that had seemed older than the season, fabrics that had not matched the weather. No names had been spoken, and yet an invitation had been given. They had followed. The place they had entered had not been familiar. Though it had worn the mask of a house, white walls, stale air, a kitchen with a clock that had never ticked. Everything had seemed suspended, like a photograph developed too long. One of the girls had been curious, especially about the phone. The device had been handed over, screen unlocked, gallery opened. A photo editing app had been shown. Not the filters, not the tools, but the liquefy brush. A simple feature meant to warp an image like soft clay. A demonstration had been started. A picture had been loaded. Someone's face, captured in dim light, expression blank. But before the tool had even been touched, the image had moved, not subtly, not accidentally. The face on the screen had smiled, not gently, not warmly, but with violence, a grin that had stretched far beyond natural width, teeth gleaming, eyes unblinking. The mouth had pulled itself open, pixel by pixel, like muscle tearing from bone. The app had not responded to inputs. The brush had been frozen, and the face had continued to warp itself, without command, without logic, without end. That had been the moment of waking. A breath had been gasped. The light had seemed too bright. The skin had felt clammy, but the room had been still. The phone had been where it always sat. The image had been gone. That afternoon, a video had been played. Background noise. Nothing more. A content creator had been streaming a horror game. Something low resolution. Foreign. Obscure. The name had been unfamiliar. The visuals low budget. Characters had been blocky. The sound design rough. And yet, at exactly 1929, a character resembling an elderly woman had appeared. By 1932, she had smiled, and the smile had been identical, not similar, the same, too wide, too bright, not rendered, but pulled. The breath had stopped again. The screen had been paused. Screenshots had been taken, zoomed, compared. No differences had been found, and then the memories had started to connect. This had not been the first time. Weeks earlier, perhaps a month, perhaps more, a different dream had occurred. A friend, face vague and warm, had been embraced beneath soft morning light. No words had been exchanged, just warmth, comfort, the kind of embrace that lingered into waking. That very afternoon, as family had left on a trip, a farewell hug had been given by someone else entirely. The angle had been the same, the timing, the pressure, the sensation. A moment repeated, not remembered, anticipated. From that day on, the dreams had been watched more carefully, and so had the days, because somewhere in that space between waking and sleep, something had been waiting, something that smiled. A pattern had begun to form, though it had not been understood at first. Each dream had seemed harmless, almost mundane, nothing like the dramatized nightmares people described. No chasing, no falling, no monsters in closets, just ordinary scenes too ordinary, played out with unnatural precision. They had started simple, a road, a room, a voice not quite right, and then the mirror, not in the dreams, but in waking life. Real moments had started to reflect those fragments seen behind closed eyes. Not exactly, but close enough to freeze the blood. Once a streetlight had flickered, just as it had in a dream the week before. Once a song on the radio had finished a sentence that had started in a dream. And then, a stranger had smiled across a train aisle, with a face that had not been familiar, until it had been recognized. Not from waking life, from sleep. The realization had come slowly, over days filled with unease. At first, the connection between the dreams and reality had seemed like coincidence, memory filling in blanks, the mind playing tricks. But eventually, the repetition had become too exact, not predictions, reflections, as if life had started answering back. The phone had been avoided for a few days, especially the editing app, but eventually, curiosity had returned. The screen had been unlocked again, the gallery opened. No changes had been noticed. The images had remained still, until the one photo, the one from the dream, had appeared again. It hadn't been saved before, not intentionally, yet there it was, a portrait slightly blurry, taken in low light, with a person whose features seemed to hover just out of clarity. It had not been remembered being taken, and worse, the face had been smiling. No filters applied, no edits made. The grin had been there, the same grin, the one from the dream, the one from the video, the one from the woman with the torn mouth and glassy stare. And when the metadata of the image had been checked, something had frozen in the chest like ice. Created 2:03 a.m. App used Ibis Paint X brush. Liquify, push. The app had been opened. The tool had been selected. The image had been manipulated. While asleep, or by something else, dreams had continued. But now something had changed. The spaces had become more vivid. The faces more familiar. People from the past had appeared, but slightly off, like puppets trying to remember who they once were. Eyes had remained fixed, movements repeated, smiles forced, and always in the background, a girl with no name, watching with a face that shifted slightly each time. She had never spoken, but she had always stared, sometimes from a window, sometimes from behind a door, sometimes from the corner of a reflection, waiting. And the more she had been seen in dreams, the more familiar faces in real life had started to resemble her, just enough to cause a moment of hesitation. A stranger's gait, a customer's posture, the reflection in a bus window that had lasted a moment too long. It had begun to feel like the dream wasn't predicting life anymore. It had started writing it. Sleep had begun to feel dangerous. Each night had brought not rest but rehearsal. Scenes that blurred the line between dream and waking, events that had not yet occurred, but soon would. And with each return to unconsciousness, the girl had stepped closer. Her presence had never been overt. She had never chased, never spoken, never moved beyond the edges of vision. But each night, she had been found closer. At first she had been glimpsed through windows in distant buildings. Then she had been seen standing behind others in the dream. Then in reflections, in spoons, puddles, phone screens, always in the background, but always watching. Her eyes had not blinked. Her smile had remained fixed, slightly too wide, teeth perfectly lined, skin stretched tight. And worse, each time she had been seen, a real-world event had followed. Small things at first, a spilled glass that mirrored the dream, a message from someone not heard from in months, a scream in the night from nowhere. But then the photo album. One morning upon waking, the gallery app had shown new images, 6 in total, each taken at 3:33 a.m. Each one had been a photo of the bedroom, from different angles. No fingerprints had been found. The phone had remained locked. The time had matched the moment the dream had shown her hand reaching out. In one of the photos she had been visible, not clearly, just a shape. In the shadow behind the curtain, a silhouette had formed. A girl with her head tilted slightly, hands at her side, mouth curled into a familiar grin. The photo had been deleted, but the imprint had remained. The dreams had begun to change. They had become less symbolic, more direct. Places once seen in life had been recreated perfectly. A kitchen light that had flickered for months. A crack in the mirror shaped like a hook. Even the way the floor creaked near the back door. All had been rendered in painful accuracy. Reality had bled into the dreams. And then the editing had resumed, not intentionally. At first, sleepwalking had been suspected, then automatic app openings. But over the next few days, images in the phone's gallery had been discovered, self-portraits taken during the night, each one altered by the liquefied tool. The mouth had always been stretched, the eyes had always been wider, and the girl had always been somewhere in the corner. In one image, she had stood in the hallway mirror. In another, she had been behind the curtain again, and in the last, partially corrupted, barely visible, her hand had been pressed to the lens. After that, the phone had been powered off, but even then, her influence had not stopped, because in a shop window, 2 days later, her reflection had returned. Same smile, same stillness, and this time, she had not disappeared when the eyes had been closed. Attempts had been made to resist sleep. Windows had been covered, mirrors turned, the phone left powered off, and locked inside a drawer lined with salt and prayer. But sleep had come anyway, creeping, not crashing, and this time, no dream had begun, not in the usual way. No road, no house, no friends, no phone, only a white void, pulsing with low frequency, like a hum that lived in the bone, and at the center of that space, she had waited, no longer distant, no longer blurred, just her, standing, smiling, no longer silent. Though her mouth had not moved, her message had been heard, pressed into the skull like heat. Words had not been spoken, yet understood. You looked too long, you smiled back. Now you're mine to frame. The next morning, the phone had been found unlocked again. The gallery had shown a new folder, hidden, not by encryption, but by instinct. It had been labeled Canvas. Inside, hundreds of photos had waited. Each one had shown a person smiling. Some had been strangers, some had been family, others had been younger versions of the viewer themselves, posed in places never visited, wearing clothes never owned, all of them smiling with her mouth. The same too wide grin, the same wet glassy eyes, the same impossible curve to the jaw, as if the face had been pulled open by invisible strings. And in the metadata of every file, a familiar timestamp had appeared: 3:33 a.m. Life had not returned to normal. Not after that. The faces of others had begun to shift slightly, like masks misaligned. Photos taken by strangers had occasionally shown distortions, smiles where none had been posed, eyes reflecting more than light. Mirrors had started to warp reflections. Glass surfaces had trembled faintly when passed. But the worst had come weeks later. In a moment of weakness, curiosity had returned. The app had been opened, just once. The liquefied tool had been selected, just to see. And in the gallery, a new photo had already been waiting. A self-portrait, not taken, not staged, but already altered, already warped, already smiling. The grin had stretched ear to ear, flesh rippling, as if animated by someone else's hand, and in the reflection of the eye, her face had been seen, half there, half outside the image, as though peering through the screen itself, watching, waiting, framing, and from then on, every dream had started with her already inside the room. The message had been found embedded in the corrupted data of a black box recovered from the seafloor, a metallic capsule dragged from beneath nearly 6,000 meters of pressure. Its casing had been warped by heat, its surface etched with microscopic fractures, as if something inside had tried to escape. No coordinates had been listed, no crew manifest had been confirmed, Only a fragment of audio, damaged but partially restorable, had survived. Its final line had ended in a scream. What had been recovered painted no clear picture, but from the moment it had been decoded, something had felt wrong. Not with the data, but with the way it made people feel. The transmission had begun with a man's voice, brittle and uneven. His name had never been recorded, but the tag stitched into the remains of a uniform found nearby had read, Technician H. Narell, Unit 39B, CNM Division. The date of the log had been smudged out by salt. The voice had spoken slowly, with forced calm. It had mentioned pressure, darkness, and a liquid that had begun to fill the craft. Not seawater, but blood. Not symbolic, not metaphorical. Blood. Thick, human, endless. The submersible had been experimental, a deep-sea model, retrofitted from a mining vessel once used to harvest rare earth metals beneath the mid-Arctic rift. Its exact purpose had been redacted from every file, but rumors had circulated of biological readings coming from beneath the rift trench, signals that should not have existed in zones deemed sterile by oceanographers. Whatever had been sent down had not been meant to return, and yet, a piece of it had. What remained of the sub, registered under the ghost designation Aeon Lance, had been hauled to the surface on April 2nd. Its outer hull had been drenched in blood, though the source had never been located. No internal power had remained. The windows had been scratched from the inside. The log had spoken of a mission, of a location no one had wanted to reach, of something alive in the trench, and of the crew, 13 of them, disappearing one by one. Narell had been the last. In his account, which had flickered through broken static and distortion, he had described the sub's interior, small, rusted, corroded by salt, never meant for long-term deployment. He had mentioned that even before the descent had completed, the walls had begun to weep. First water, then blood, dripping from the seams, seeping through the rivets, creeping through the vents. Sensors had malfunctioned. Lights had dimmed. Readings had shown impossible depths, as if the ocean beneath had expanded. Crew members had reported dreams, shared ones, filled with the same symbols, the same whispers, the same great shadow beneath the current. Narell had claimed that the blood hadn't arrived suddenly. It had grown, from puddles, to pools, then to waves. He had said the fluid carried faces, half-formed, drifting just beneath the surface, rising toward the portholes, pressing against the glass with open mouths. The others had been taken, not through violence, not through sound, just gone, one by one, as if dissolved into the red. No bodies had been found, and so the voice log had continued, until the last entry, the one in which Narell had confessed what none of the files had mentioned, that the mission had not been about exploration. It had been a containment, and the sub had been the bait. The interior of the Aeon Lance had never been designed for comfort. Claustrophobia had been expected. Aisles had been narrow, controls coated in salt-worn residue, and the air had always carried the trace of metal and mold. Over time, even time itself had felt warped, unspooled into meaningless stretches, where memory and hallucination had fused. According to the corrupted log, the bleeding had begun within 19 hours of submersion. Patches of red had been noticed first near the drainage valves beneath the hydrostatic balancer. At first, they had been thought to be rust, then organic matter, then biological leakage from a failed experiment. But the consistency had matched human hemoglobin. Lab tests hadn't been possible. The onboard analysis bay had failed almost immediately. Attempts to contact the surface had been met with static. Attempts to rise had been met with force. Narell had written of a pull, not a mechanical malfunction, but a deliberate refusal by the sea to let the vessel rise. Depth sensors had begun to report impossible values, 22,000 meters, then 30, then 50. By the time the readings had passed 70,000, only 4 crew members had remained visible. One of them, Dr. Morian, the vessel's biomedical analyst, had been found floating upright in the central stairwell. Her eyes had remained open. Her mouth had been filled with blood. Her body had remained untouched by trauma, yet her lungs had been missing. No breach had been detected. No screams had been recorded. The others had vanished in much the same way. One had dissolved between blinks, a technician known for tapping his foot nervously. The sound had stopped. When Narelle had looked, only the boots had remained, floating in place, filled with nothing but blood. Another had been dragged through the floor, without a mark left behind. The commander's last known act had been opening the side storage panel to retrieve the flare gun, used not for signal, but as an act of final resistance. No gunfire had been heard, just silence, and the blood had risen higher. By the time the crew had been reduced to 2, Narelle had taken over the logs. His voice had cracked, his words slowed. The air had been described as wet, difficult to breathe, as if infused with something thicker than oxygen. Then the faces had returned, not illusions, not delusions, not imagined. They had appeared just behind the windows, in the dark, in the red, mouths wide, noses absent, skin stretched tight, as if underwater for decades. They had pressed gently against the glass, never shattering it, just waiting. He had named them. Some had resembled the crew, others had not, and then one by one they had begun to whisper back. Within the final audio entries, Narelle had begun to describe internal changes. He had spoken of losing his reflection, of shadows that did not match his movement, of a heartbeat in the walls, not his own. The lighting had failed by then save for the central emergency beacon, which had bathed the vessel in a throbbing red pulse. The blood had risen past the 3rd rung of the ladder. He had stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He had begun talking to something else, not on the logs, not directly, but between the words phrases had crept in that had not been his. You will join. The sea remembers. Flesh returns to source. By then the blood had reached his chest. The final readable log had been brief. Narelle had mentioned a camera, one last photo, one final attempt to show whoever found the wreckage what had waited for them, and then the scream, not human, not single, layered. Audio levels had spiked. The file had ended. The timestamp had shown no date. After the logs had ended, the silence on board the Eon Lance had become the true torment. No words had been left behind. No more recordings had been recovered, but the walls had continued to speak in their own language, drips, groans, and the steady pulse of something unseen. The walls had expanded and contracted, not from pressure, but as if breathing. The metal had begun to warp inward, not crushed by depth, but invited inward by some hunger older than the ocean, and the blood had continued to rise. Every vent, every pipe, every screw had begun to leak. The origin had never been located. No wound had been found in the hull. The fluid had simply manifested, with consistency too rich, too thick, and too warm for any natural explanation. The interior air had become saturated with iron. Breathing had felt like inhaling steam from a slaughterhouse. Reuben had written of a film that clung to the skin, not sweat, but something layered, almost alive. Then had come the dreams. Though alone, Narelle had begun recording fragments of thoughts that had not originated from within. Visions of something massive, coiled and sleeping in the deep. No form had been clearly described, only impressions. Teeth without mouths, eyes that bled shadow, limbs that moved with the weight of memory itself. The blood had become a medium, a lens. Whenever Narelle had peered into it, visions had returned, not of the present, not of the sub, but of an impossible world below, a city made of bone, spires of cartilage, streets paved with ribs and finger bones, and in its center, something watching. The entity had never been named, but its presence had become undeniable. It had not chased the crew. It had waited, it had been patient, and the submersible had not been the first. Along the exterior hull, etchings had been discovered, glyphs not made by human tools, faintly carved symbols spiraling outward in a pattern that suggested intelligence or ritual. Some of them had matched carvings recovered from shipwrecks centuries old. Others had never been seen before. The blood level had risen to the ceiling, and yet the vessel had not flooded. Air had still remained. Light had still flickered. Time had refused to pass in a linear way. Days had been replaced with pulses, sleep with blackouts, hunger with a low vibration in the spine that had grown unbearable. The log had ended, but what had followed had been imprinted in other ways, on the walls, on the ceiling, and most terrifyingly, on Narelle's body. Though presumed dead, the skeletal remains found within the craft had not belonged to Narelle. The skull had been fractured from within. The bones had been hollowed, marrow drained clean. Inside the left femur, carved from within, a symbol had been found. When decoded, it had translated to one word in an ancient script: awakened. What had returned to the surface had not been Narelle. The submersible Aeon Lance, once a tool of exploration and containment, had been found adrift, its emergency beacon pulsing not upward, but downward toward the trench. Its signal had looped in a frequency that did not match any modern system. The pulse had matched a human heartbeat, slower, heavier, wider. When the sub had been opened, rescue personnel had been overwhelmed by the atmosphere within. Blood had coated every interior surface, still warm, still fresh, impossibly fresh. The equipment had rusted beyond repair. All digital records had been destroyed, except the single corrupted log extracted manually from the backup memory. No crew had been found, except one. The skeletal remains recovered in the control room had not been complete. Pieces had been missing, but even with partial structure, strange growths had been noted, calcified filaments extending from the spine into the walls of the vessel. The bones had not been broken. They had been woven into the craft. The ship had absorbed its last occupant. Within the eye socket of the skull, a fragment of glass had been wedged. When examined, it had been identified as part of the onboard camera lens, shattered from the inside. The last photo had been recovered from the memory card lodged in the wall panel. The image had been partially corrupted, but partially visible. What had been captured had not been the inside of the sub, but the outside. A massive form had been seen pressed against the viewing glass, a face wide and eyeless, with folds of skin that seemed to breathe in reverse. Rows of teeth, not in a mouth, but spiraling across the head, had gleamed in the light. Behind it, veins of bone and black tissue had extended beyond the edge of visibility, branching like deep-sea coral. No movement had been recorded. The timestamp had shown no date, and in the corner of the image, reflected dimly in the blood-slicked panel, the suggestion of a figure had been seen. Not Narelle, not the crew, but something wearing their outline, something standing, watching, smiling. 2 months after recovery, the Aeon Lance had been sealed in a government facility beneath Arctic soil. It had since been moved. All data associated with the mission had been erased. Any reference to CNM Unit 39B had been struck from naval archives. But sometimes, across encrypted networks, fragments of corrupted audio had still been shared. A voice, rasping, unstable, could be heard saying one final line, looped into static. If this reaches you, I never left. It's in me now, and the ocean is full.